I have the honor of welcoming Herb Grover, the Vice President of the Weminuche Audubon Society, and Keith Bruno, Southwest Colorado Community Naturalist with the Audubon Rockies. And today they will be sharing their experience and findings from a 5-year citizen science project conducted around Pagosa Springs, Colorado. And without further ado, I will hand it over to them.
All right, thank you, Colin. We're sure glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started with the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to assume everybody can see my screen, and if not, Colin will sure let me know. So, at any rate, I'm glad to be here today. We're going to talk about the impact of wildland fuel reduction treatments on bird communities and dry mixed conifer forests around Pagosa Springs, Colorado. We're also going to discuss the value of citizen science in discovering the richness and diversity of the forest bird communities in our area. I'll be joined by Keith Bruno. He's the Southwest Colorado Community Naturalist with Audubon Rockies, and he's one of the key coordinators on this project. The other person who's a coordinator is Gene Zernhelt, that you see in a picture in the lower right on your screen. So what we'll be talking about today is a summary of the results from a study that's been underway for 5 years in the Ponderosa Pine forests here in Pagosa country. Now, partners in this citizen science effort include Audubon Rockies through the participation of Keith, the San Juan Headwaters Forest Health Partnership, the San Juan National Forest Pagosa Ranger District, and the Mountain Studies Institute. So as we begin, I'm going to turn this over to Keith for a few introductory and background slides.
There you go. You're good. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good to be here with you. Thanks for taking time out of your day to listen in for this session with the Forest Stewards Guild. We appreciate Colin welcoming us into this series. So wanted to give you guys a little context about who we are and what we do. Just to back up a second, also, Herb introduced me. I am a community naturalist at Audubon Rockies. That's just a fancy term for an educator here. I work with students, I work with adults, and I love that I get to jump in and out of working with different age groups. So it's been an excellent situation for me. I'm the only Audubon Rockies employee down in Southwest Colorado. I wish I had another, but I do have the substantial support of the volunteers from the Weminuche Audubon Society, like Herb, like Gene, and so many others that have helped us realize these projects. So I want to tell you a little bit about our educational programs. And first of all, we've got, through Weminuche Audubon, we are a chapter. We're part of the chapter network with Audubon. And for those of you who are kind of confused on, I guess, the hierarchy or the various Audubon affiliations, there is National Audubon Society, which is essentially the national representation. Then you zoom into state or regional offices. You guys have a Audubon Southwest contingent in New Mexico and Arizona. I'm part of Audubon Rockies, which is Colorado, Wyoming, Utah. And then you zoom even further into local chapters, and that's where Weminuche Audubon Society comes into play. And a robust chapter it is. Some of the things that we have going and have had going for a number of years are monthly programs. We have guest speakers that come in monthly. We have just recently we had Dr. Terry Root speak on climate change. We've had a wildlife biologist from San Luis Valley, the Del Norte district, come in and tell us about species of concern in the state of Colorado. We do trainings, birding trainings. Sometimes we get outside of the subject matter of birds, etc. So it's a pretty wide scope. Great speakers. We have a Bird of the Week, a long-standing column with our local paper, the Pagosa Springs Sun. Herb and I have written some ourselves, and our main writer is probably the president, Gene Zernhelt. She takes it upon herself. She loves writing the Bird of the Week every week, so that's a really well-followed piece in our local paper. Educational programs with 4 Mile Ranch. Herb has Hershey Ranch on here. That's the old name. Essentially, it's a ranch that was owned by the Hershey Foundation for a number of years, and we provide education to about 1,000 students each fall. general field ecology tours that kind of build in subject matter. And we have students from not only Southwest Colorado, but also from Dulce, New Mexico. So trying to reach more regional students. So certainly trying to get students up from New Mexico as well. Science on Snow, we do some programs in the winter with fifth grade students at Predominate Springs Middle School, as well as other schools locally, just trying to connect those pieces, watershed health with natural resource health at large. Birds, we get to go take them birding for the Great Backyard Bird Count along the San Juan River Walk downtown, right through Pagosa Springs. Sometimes they've done workshops with Herb on forestry and understanding tree rings and dendrochronology lessons, etc. So good fun. We have a Riverwalk Naturalist program, folks. That it's a volunteer-led interpretive tour of the wetlands downtown Pagosa. That's been fantastic. And kind of a addendum to that is the Pagosa Wetland Partners, which is an advocacy group for the downtown wetlands that helped with Weminuche Audubon provide interpretive signage, and we do regular water sampling in the wetlands to make sure that there's that there's no changes that are unforeseen. We have a native plants garden, a demonstration garden, just trying to encourage people to plant native for the benefit of birds and other pollinators. That's a fantastic project and very visible if you're passing through town, right by the geothermal greenhouse partnership, the geodesic domes downtown. Our garden is located at that site. We're going to be talking about the bird monitoring project today, some of our community science engagement, Christmas bird count. For about 15 years now, we've been actively collecting data on our overwintering bird populations here through the Christmas bird count. Hopefully some of you are engaged in the CBC in your communities. Mexican spotted owls. We've just this last 2 years, we've been using autonomous recording units, or ARUs, to passively look for Mexican spotted owls in a local mountain range just west of here. No detection so far, but that could have implications for how the watershed is managed. We monitor American dipper nests. So as a part of Nest Watch, we work with Durango Bird Club and other groups to collect observations on dipper nests in many of the forks of the rivers outside of Pagosa. And we also do surveys on private ranches, one of which being the Banded Peak Ranch up in northwest New Mexico, or northeast New Mexico. Okay, there is a link for this fact sheet. You guys see this fact sheet in front of you. Herb is going to be talking through this. Don't feel like you need to read through all this. It'll make you dizzy on the screen. But at your leisure, we will provide links, and Colin's going to provide some of those in the chat box. So you can find this particular fact sheet, this project summary, through our Weminuche Audubon site. You can go ahead and advance. And in addition to that project summary, Colin will provide the link to essentially our Weminuche Audubon landing site. And then from there, you can follow the project tabs and dive into either videos that Herb's made over the 5 or 6 years that we've been conducting the project, and associated fact sheets, etc. So, as well as other things we were doing. So we're going to dive in. I want to dive in a little more specifically to what we're talking about today, and kind of introduce the project. We'll refer to it here as Bird Monitoring Project, but essentially this is ongoing citizen science or community science that we've done in tandem with the Forest Health Collaborative, San Juan's Forest Health Collaborative here locally. And just wanted to roll out some of our objectives and goals with the project. So first and foremost, we started with a question, and we wanted to investigate how forest birds and the avian community respond to wildland fuel reduction treatments. So that was really where this whole project came to be. Was we had chapter members saying, hey, we see that some of the forest has been drastically changed through fuels reduction. We know it's providing more safety for our community, but how does that impact the bird community? So among our chapter volunteers, we've really also sought to promote a heightened understanding of the role of fire in the mixed dry conifer forest. So really connecting these volunteers, our membership, with fire ecology and forest ecology. Herb's been a professor of this for 40 years. I've spent a lot of my years doing field work and taking associated natural resource classes, but not everyone has. So just trying to bring everyone up to a better understanding. So that's been another one of our objectives with this project is really just getting them into the field, have volunteers, witnessing not when birds arrive in nests, but also what flowers bloom when. Number 3, improving bird skills. That, excuse me, that goes without saying. I think really the biggest piece of this was let's keep people out in the field and working together to provide identification on birds. We have people who are great birders by sight. We have others who are great by ear. And we have a lot of photographers in the group who really are great at capturing images that help folks to ID. So working together, I think that's been a big piece. Number 4, helping participants gain an understanding of how field studies are conducted. A lot of folks, again, didn't necessarily follow that same track or career path. And so field studies are something that's maybe novel to them in their retirement. And so this provides context on questions and methodology, in terms of starting their own project or other community science initiatives. Number 5, strengthening a sense of community. I think this is really a big piece. Is really, we just wanted to bring our group together, have them connect in the field, sharing their skills towards a common goal. And I think this has been fully realized through the project. So fantastic. We'll move on to the next slide. There we go. A little bit more about our volunteers. Why would volunteers want to participate in a project like this? So, there's some overlap across some of these slides, but, I think a big piece is people want to improve their birding skills. I, as an educator with Audubon, I personally get that a lot of time. People are seeking new resources. They're seeking opportunities, events, etc. In a changing world, I think it gives people some sense of control. How can they help? How can they contribute to understanding the changes that we're going through? Contributing to community science allows people to find a sense of purpose. I think that is kind of covered in that last point. But, again, it's one thing to go out and go birding and take a walk. And I think that's very important in its own right. I'm not saying otherwise. But it is also fantastic when people realize, hey, this is actually going to be, this data is going to be collected and could have implications on, how maybe our forest is managed, et cetera. So that's a little extra, ups the stakes, I should say. Birding by ear, has been really fun. I think it offers folks a new challenge and encourages us to get better at birding. And so really for all of us, I think that's been a really fun one, is to get out in the field and see who's singing when and follow along with behaviors, locate nests, etc. Exercise. I think a lot of our group has seen this as a great opportunity to exercise, get out in the forest early. There's no better way to start the day. So get out in the field, and Herb will talk a little bit more about our methodology, but get out there and initiate your day with something that's very relaxing and gives back. Now, how do we get volunteers to participate? Well, we provide classes on both visual and auditory identification. I do a lot of that. We also do Christmas bird count trainings in the winter, and so we have a lot of overlap with some of our resident birds. But then again, we have a lot of migratory birds that we see during this project. So it's kind of a mix. But really covering a lot of bird ID, I think, helps build confidence and skills. We do a spring tune-up class on birding by ear. That'll happen actually next week, May 15th. Folks are welcome to Zoom in. If you want to find any of that information, you can go to the Weminuche Audubon website and find it through there. Am I right with 60% of our field detections are auditory?
It's actually a little bit higher than that this year, but yeah. Okay. About 70 to 80%, actually.
Yeah, so as you'll find more out from Herb, essentially, just the birding by ear piece has really opened up. We noticed that over the first 2 years or so. I think our first year, folks were still not as confident as they've become now. And we just saw increasing identifications through birding by ear, and that's on our data sheet. Was it by sight or by ear? We also, we provide an in-field training. So we walk the routes, the loops at each site, conduct a sample 6-minute point count, work on sifting through bird songs and calls, and we try to pinpoint differences between, something as similar as a chipping sparrow and a dark-eyed junco, or an orange-crowned warbler for that matter. So, if any of you are familiar with those species, they have a similar pattern to the song. And so parsing those out is great to do with people in the field and get them feeling confident about separating. And then repetition is the name of the game. Really, birders learn through repetition. and from one another. So, visits to our respective sites to allow for that discovery has provided, locations on nests and nuances that otherwise aren't apparent. Next slide. Thanks, Herb. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Herb, just some of our reactions and at some point, if you have the opportunity, watch the video. There's some great testimonials in there from various volunteers over the years, and in multiple videos. Herb will even have them read a Wendell-Berry poem in one of the most recent videos, and it's powerful because I really do think this project means a lot to them. But again, birding with a purpose, that's big. That's a big piece. Gives people confidence, a sense of fulfillment, and by doing so, we're contributing to the conversation and discerning potential impacts of management implications, or decisions. We're hopefully influencing the decision making. That's what we'd like to believe. So we're working towards that. Learning the natural history of birds. People really have attested to how much more they've learned about birds, how much stronger they feel about the bird communities here in terms of being able to connect with who's here, when do species arrive, what are they eating, where do they nest. That's been fun. Volunteers have also reported on learning more about forest ecology at large, successions of plant diversity in the forest, and how they respond to fuels reduction treatments. I think it provides a window into the phenological progression in the forest. People love coming out and seeing that role of wildflowers and what's blooming when. So it's more than just the birds, and I think that they've connected around a lot of these different facets, and they've connected to the place. Returning to the same site allows for an enriched field experience. We all know that. The more that we can visit a place in and out of different seasons, the more that we connect with it. Improved birding skills, certainly that's a big piece that volunteers have reported. Getting to know their fellow birders and like-minded folks in the area. I think that's really, again, building that community. That's been a big one. And more than anything, I would say we've retained a lot of volunteers through this project because of the enthusiasm around the activity, around how it makes them feel, not only that purpose, but again, feeling connected with a group towards a common goal. And I think that's been a big asset to this project. I'm going to turn it back over to Herb. Thanks for listening, guys.
All righty. Thanks, Keith. And I think one of the reasons why it was important for us to go through that kind of background material, at least two reasons. One is we consider I would say the corollary objectives of the project, which have to do with the experience of the volunteers, to be of equal importance to the scientific question that we've been addressing. So now we're going to talk more and more about the findings of our project and the detail, a little bit of detail of what we've been through. First of all, my training has been in ecosystems ecology, and taught for most of my career, especially over the last 25 years in the classroom. And I'm still a becoming birder, I guess you'd say. And I find myself here in Pagosa very active in the Weminuche Audubon because it's one of the most influential conservation organizations in our region. So I've become kind of the coordinator and the facilitator and the data analyst and the report preparer for our bird monitoring project. Now, just in case there are any of you out there who are intrigued by this concept of citizen science, I want to highlight a couple of issues that we often encounter when we have volunteers involved in these kinds of projects. Well, first of all, the volunteers have varying bird identification skills, and they change and improve through time. And secondly, we have over 60 volunteers that have been involved in this project over the course of the study. And at least 20 of those volunteers have been involved in each sample season. And about a dozen of us have been involved across the entire 5 years of the study. Well, many of our volunteers travel, which complicates scheduling. And also, some of our volunteers have limited physical abilities. There's some titanium knees and hips out there, if you catch my drift. And so we have to factor that into the design of our study areas. Finally, the audience that's most interested in our findings are primarily non-scientists. And because we have limited access to research level statistical software, we keep our analysis of the data pretty straightforward. So we're not going to be talking about any sophisticated statistics or modeling or anything like that. So over the past 5 years, we've included 4 different sites in our study, with 3 sites sampled in each year. The names of those sites are Turkey Springs, Fawn Gulch, Jackson Mountain, and Jackson Mountain North. And I'll be talking about the characteristics of those and the data from those sites as we move forward. So at each of those sites, we have 3 loops, and each of those loops consists of 5 sample points that are about 75 meters apart. And as we'll see, we return to those monitoring points about 10 times during a 6-week monitoring period from about the 3rd week of May to about the 2nd week of July. And we go to each of those points about 10 times. And a visitation to one of those points consists of a 6-minute survey period, during which all of the birds that can be identified by sight or by song are recorded. Now, our ability to record bird species by song has been supplemented by the use of the Merlin bird identification app that comes out of Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So we use that to confirm the bird species that we've identified by song. Now, at the bottom half of the upper half of this slide, you see the distribution of these sites. They're all within about 15 miles or so of Pagosa Springs. Down in the lower left and lower right, we have a picture of the Turkey Springs site. And this site was subject to prescribed fire just at the time when we were setting up our monitoring points in May of 2019. Now, because of that, and you'll be able to compare these sites by looking at the pictures that I show here, but the shrub layer at Turkey Springs is less developed, although it has recovered considerably. It's less developed than we see at some of our other sites. Now, Fawn Gulch, another site, was masticated, or the shrub layer was mowed in 2017. And there's been a very healthy recovery of that shrub layer. And of course, Fawn Gulch has been sampled all 5 years of our project. Turkey Springs, only the first 3 years. Now, as a reference site, we selected a place on Jackson Mountain that has been untreated for many decades. So there's not been any fire or logging that can be identified as having an impact on that forest in recent years. It has the most diverse tree layer and thickest understory shrub layer of the 4 sites that we're going to talk about. Now, in 2022, we added the Jackson Mountain North site to our study. And this site was added to collect baseline data as part of what's called the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change program. And this is a nationwide program, as you can see in the map at the lower right, where the investigators are studying alternative selective logging strategies to affect the forest's ability to respond to climate change. So what we're basically doing is collecting baseline data to support that program.
And you want to tell them when it'll be treated?
Yeah, it's likely to be thinned later on this year or next year. So when we finish this year's sampling, we'll have 3 years of data from that site. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of our findings, and then we'll go in and talk about each of these. So first of all, based on the number of bird species and number of birds that we've observed, we don't think prescribed fire or mastication has any long-term impacts on the composition of the bird communities. Secondly, there are more bird species in our forests than kind of incidental or casual observation would indicate. We've found 88 bird species with over 10,000 birds counted. Now, of those, 9 of those bird species have been observed at all 3 sites that have been sampled in each year of the study. Now, if we expand that and we look at the 34 species that are observed somewhere, at least one location in each year of the study, that accounts for 84% of the birds counted. So I'm going to talk about this commonness versus rarity coming up. Now, about half of the bird species that we have documented are resident or local migrants. And in fact, all but three of there are 44, I think, species that are resident. All but three of them show up in our Christmas bird count. Now, another thing that we're going to talk about is the foraging strategy of the bird species, the feeding behaviors. And we'll be talking about ground brush foraging, timber foliage searching, and fly catching, and so forth. But ground brush foraging bird species were most common at Turkey Spring and Fawn Gulch and Jackson Mountain. But we will see a little bit later on a difference in the Jackson Mountain North site where timber foliage and searching species are more common. We're also going to talk about nesting behavior. Now, most of the bird species that we have documented out there are that will nest in trees or shrubs. There are a couple that'll nest on the ground, but we're most interested in cavity nesting bird species because we want to make certain that standing dead snag trees are preserved as much as possible because they are a tremendous resource to these cavity nesting bird species, and we'll talk more about that. We're also going to talk more about birds that are of special concern because of declining population numbers. So we've looked at a number of reports provided by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and some of you may be familiar with this, but we've lost something on the order of 3 billion birds since 1970. That's about 1 in 4 birds. So many of the species that we've encountered are exhibiting significant decline in their population numbers. And I'm going to be highlighting those as we move forward. And this is particularly of concern for migratory species. And again, we'll be talking about that. So let's begin by talking about this commonness versus rarity. So the data here illustrates what is a consistent trend that's often reported in ecological studies. And that is that typically a few species are very common with many species that are uncommon to rare. And we'll find this if we're studying plants or birds or insects. This is a pattern that is often seen. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we've documented 88 species and counted something on the order of 10,000 birds. And if we look at those 9 species that are observed everywhere, every year, they represent about 45% of the birds we've counted. If we extend that to birds that we see somewhere every year, that's 34 species. That includes those 9 species, by the way. And that comes up to about 85%, 84% of the birds that we've counted. So that means there are 54 species out there that are represented by only 16% or so of the birds that we've counted. Well, we need to be concerned about those uncommon and less common species, as well as for those species that are fairly common. Now, we should look at some examples. We don't just want to talk about data. So examples of the most common species that we've encountered are the northern flicker, violet-green swallow, American robin, and the yellow-rumped warbler. Now, as I go through some of these slides with examples, you'll notice that I've highlighted some of the species names, common names, in yellow. And those that are highlighted in yellow are those species that are exhibiting population declines according to the reports that we have access to. So let's look at some examples of some of those uncommon species. These include the dusky flycatcher, McGillivray's warbler, ruby-crowned kinglet, and red-naped sapsucker. Interestingly enough, the ruby-crowned kinglet, which is not exhibiting population declines, but is uncommon in our data set, is relatively common at that Jackson Mountain North site. So there are some interesting and intriguing differences between our sites that many of which we won't have time to talk about today. Now, I mentioned earlier that our observation is that the bird community recovers pretty quickly following wildland fuel reduction treatments, meaning prescribed fire or mastication. So if you look at the blue histogram, that's the Turkey Spring site that was subject to prescribed fire. And the number of species that we encountered there was pretty low in that first year, right after the fire was conducted. And then you see it recovers pretty quickly to about between 35 to 40 species that we documented. Now, that tells us, well, there's pretty decent recovery there, especially when we compare it to the amber colored bars, which represent the Fawn Gulch site. And you see that that site hovers around about 40 species per year. And that was masticated in 2017. So that's one of our richest sites. Now you'll notice an increase, by the way, in 2023, and that probably reflects the use of the Merlin app, and that expanded our ability to identify birds by song. And so we see an increase both at Fawn Gulch and Jackson Mountain as a result of that. Now also take a look at the yellow bars over to the right. That's the Jackson Mountain North site, and you'll see that that has a reduced number of species, and we're going to talk more about the composition of that bird community coming up. But the Jackson Mountain North site had the densest canopy, and the understory was quite a lot different there at Jackson Mountain North as well because of that dense overstory canopy. So here are just a couple of views to give you a sense of how those sites differed. So in the top, we have the Fawn Gulch. So this is one of the most diverse bird community sites that we encountered, similar in many ways to the Jackson Mountain reference site. And then over to the lower right is the Jackson Mountain North site. And that picture kind of depicts how complicated the canopy is there and dense the canopy is, so that the understory layers in some areas is almost lacking because it's so well shaded. So it just allows us to make an overall observation that the composition and density of understory and overstory strongly influences bird diversity. And that's not a monumental observation. It's probably pretty intuitive. But we were able to clearly document that. Another thing that we did was look at feeding behavior. So we categorized birds based on what they ate and how they got it. So most of the forest birds that we observed are insectivorous during the breeding season. Now they'll shift to granivorous at other times of the year, but primarily insectivorous when we're out there recording them. So they're grouped by where and how they find the insects that they feed on. So for example, some of these categories are pretty intuitive. Ground brush foraging, you can picture where those birds are feeding, and the timber foliage searching. They're the birds that are going to be scrambling around on the branches and stepping out onto the foliage and looking for insects and grubs and so forth that are found on the foliage.
Making you croon your neck, making birders croon their
neck. Yeah, that's why you need the binoculars. But also you have aerial flycatchers and flycatchers. They're going to perch on a branch and then sally out. It's called sallying, when they fly out and capture an insect as it's flying by. And then basic woodpeckers are timber drilling and gleaning. Now we're just going to talk about the ground brush foraging and timber foliage searching in this slide. So you see that in the red circles in the top, the graphs at the top on the right, the ground brush foraging species are most common at Turkey Springs. I didn't include the Turkey Springs graph, by the way. It looks very similar to the Fawn Gulch and Jackson Mountain. But the ground brush foraging is the most common feeding guild in those sites. But you go to Jackson Mountain North, and it's the timber foliage searching species that are most common, with the ground brush foraging second most common. And in fact, look at the height of those histograms. There are over 50% of the birds counted at Jackson Mountain North were timber foliage searching. So this again reflects a distinctive difference in the quality of habitat that those sites provide. Okay, time for some birdie pictures. Let's look at some examples. So examples of ground brush foraging species include the dark-eyed junco, the chipping sparrow, the western bluebird, and the mountain bluebird. You'll notice that all of these are highlighted, meaning they are all exhibiting declines in their population numbers. So how about some examples of timber foliage searching species? These include the Plumbeus vireo, the red-breasted nuthatch, the warbling vireo, and the western tanager. And again, these are exhibiting population declines. Well, let's say a few words about nesting behavior. I need to hurry up here a little bit. I know we're extending our time a little further than we'd like, but at any rate, of the 88 bird species in our study, 49 were tree shrub nesting species, 19 were ground cliff or other nesting species, but 20 are cavity nesting species. And these represent between 20 to 45% of the birds counted at a site. So here are some examples. You see a shrub cup nesting bird in the upper right, the warbling vireo. And then we have a couple of cavity nesting birds here, the house wren and the white-breasted nuthatch. Now let's look at a few other examples. One of the most exciting finds that we had was the common nighthawk, and we found nests of the common nighthawk at both Turkey Springs and Fawn Gulch. These are sites where wildland fuel reduction treatments had been applied. They were more open canopies, and the ground was more open. And you see in the lower left a nest of a common nighthawk. And in my view, what they do is walk along and an egg falls out of their butt, and they decide, well, I think I'll lay another one next to it, and that constitutes a nest. But when they hatch, you look at the hatchlings over on the right, they are extremely well camouflaged. So we felt incredibly fortunate to have seen these in each year of the study at those two sites. They're not found at either of the Jackson Mountain sites because the canopy is more closed and the shrub layer is denser as well. But when it comes to cavity nesting behavior, we can look at this and talk about what's called nest webs, because cavity nesters categorized into primary, secondary, or what I'm going to call opportunistic. So primary cavity nesters are those birds that can excavate new cavities whenever they need a new nest. Secondary cavity nesting birds have to use the cavities that somebody else made for them. And then there's some opportunistic species, and they will either make their own cavities or use an existing cavity. Now, it turns out the northern flicker, one of those populations and species in population decline, is critical to excavating new cavities in our forests. And so we consider them to be a keystone cavity excavator or nester. Now, some others, the white-breasted nuthatch and downy woodpeckers and so forth, they can use existing cavities. And in fact, oftentimes their cavities are in living trees, not in dead trees. But we've made a point of emphasizing to the Forest Service that we need to be more careful about protecting standing dead snags. We have some snags where we've documented 4 species of cavity nesting birds, all using the same snag in the same year. But at any rate,
same time too.
Yeah. So at Turkey Springs, in that data set, we've got 45% of the birds that we counted out there are cavity nesters, and that's largely because of the violet green swallow that's present out there in many years. Fawn Gulch, about 21%. There we find northern flickers and pygmy nuthatches and white-breasted nuthatches there. Jackson Mountain, about 30%, and Jackson Mountain North, about 24% of the birds counted. So we've shared this information with the Forest Service. They've been very receptive, and they are paying closer attention to protecting some of those standing dead snags. In fact, they have a wildlife tree program that we've participated in. If you find a standing dead snag that's roughly about 15 inches in diameter, within about 300 feet of a forest road, you can put one of these plaques on there, and maybe that dead snag will get left behind for the use by cavity nesting birds. Okay, we're almost coming to the end. Hang in there. We're going to talk about migratory and population status. In other words, we have resident species and non-resident species, and I talked about these early in the presentation. So we have about 47 resident species, about 41 non-resident species. But if we look at the resident versus non-resident species in terms of the number of species that are in decline versus stable, we notice that migration is pretty risky business. That of the 41 non-resident or migratory, long-distance migratory species, 25 of those are showing population declines, whereas only about a third of the resident species are exhibiting population declines. So here are some of the examples of resident species that are in decline. The Plumbeus vireo and the red crossbill, Townsend solitaire, and the Lewis's woodpecker. Now, we're very blessed by the Lewis's woodpecker here in Pagosa Springs. It's almost a common species here, but there are only estimated to be about 70,000 of these worldwide. And they do hang around during the winter. They migrate locally, go a little bit further south, but we do encounter them in the Christmas bird count. So we feel very fortunate to have the Lewis's woodpecker here. Now, the migratory species that are in decline include the Grace's warbler, dusky flycatcher, the western tanager, which I consider the clowns of the forest because they're so colorful, and the western wood peewees. Now, some of these we see quite frequently. The western tanager and western wood peewee are pretty common in our data set, but they're migratory species and they are in decline. So they come here to breed. This is the place where they make their babies. This is important to them. So we're almost done. Let's go through some takeaways here. The first one is there are more bird species in our surrounding forests than we can appreciate by incidental viewing of the most common species. What that means is long-term monitoring efforts are important for identifying the presence of the less common or rare species. You've got to get out there, you've got to spend some time, you've got to be patient. And that's one of the greatest values of this project. Now, the birds in our forests are important consumers of insects as well. So if those insect populations are left unchecked, you can imagine that they could impair forest health because many of those insects are feeding on the understory shrubs and plants and on the trees as well. Fourth, at least half of the bird species observed at our sites are migratory and are at a higher risk of population decline. So again, what that says is how we manage our forests here has a significant impact on those bird populations preparing themselves for the threats they face across their migratory routes. Now, that's what is the point that's made is number 5. And so number 6 is the implication of forest management practices to the health of bird communities apply to overall forest health as well, because again, keep in mind most of the birds that we've documented are feeding on insects which affect forest health. And that is the end of our presentation. So I'd be happy to entertain, and Keith as well, any questions that you might have. And Colin, just tell me when you'd like me to stop sharing the screen.
Sure. Feel free and keep it up for now. Thank you both so much. This is super interesting. And it's a fun ending photo as well. Like to dive straight into a question from Alice. And this was in regards to your snag slide. So with talking about like Forest Service recommendation to keep more snags, would that include trying to protect the snags during fuel reduction treatments?
Yeah, partly. The Forest Service has a guideline, I think, of 2 dead snags per acre, which oftentimes can be achieved pretty easily. And sometimes there are more than that per acre. What we're trying to encourage the Forest Service to do is leave them if they can. However, they do harvest, or sometimes it's incidental, because if you've seen the forestry equipment, it's big and cumbersome sometimes, and they're not all that nimble. And so some of those standing dead snags come down as part of the thinning process, so to speak. So the question is, would that include trying to protect the snags during fuel reduction? And I would say yes, whenever possible. And are we talking about thinning or burning or both? Well, the Forest Service makes that decision site by site based on the characteristics. Sometimes it's easier to go in and masticate. So for example, there's a slope right here in Pagosa Springs called Reservoir Hill. Well, it would cause a lot of problems if they tried to use prescribed fire right in town. So they masticate that site. There's some other sites that are more difficult to get to, and it's easier to hand thin. And basically what they do is they go through the forest and they collect branches, cut branches at a certain height off of many of the trees, pile them up and burn piles of debris. Prescribed fire is not always just, setting fire to the forest and standing back and hoping it doesn't get away from you, although that does happen. And sadly, we know about that. Sometimes it's more or less a controlled process of accumulating some of that fuel, putting it in a particular location, and just burning it as a pile. So we've seen both of those taking place. Now, do we have both mastication and burning in some locations? Perhaps, but I'm not familiar with any locations near us where both have been applied at the same time. Usually it's at different times. So I hope I answered that question okay.
May I follow up?
Please.
Sure.
Sorry, not to dominate, but sorry. So in that case, like what I took away, like the question that I'm interested in trying to answer is like, what's the impact on bird populations of basically like thinning and forest treatment to prevent forest fires? Because I've seen people argue that the impact on bird populations can be really deleterious as an argument for doing no intervention in forests to try to prevent fire. So like I was interested to see that bird populations rebounded a couple of years after these treatments. I wonder if there's any difference in whether there's like mastication, pile burns, or broadcast burns in terms of like the impact on bird populations.
Well, that's a good question. And I'm thinking of the literature and trying to figure out what's out there in the literature. I think there's been a lot of research in Arizona in particular on the responsive bird community to prescribed fire. Not so much to mastication. In fact, I haven't seen very much research done with mastication other than our project. What I can say is the oak, the Gamble's oak, that is the primary shrub in our shrub layer here, recovers pretty quickly. The mastication does not mow to the ground. It really is very destructive to the branches that are sticking up above the ground, and it shreds them. But there are buds located below that disturbed layer in the shrubs, and they recover pretty quickly. So that Fawn Gulch site, for example, when we first started out there, most of the oak shrubs that had recovered were less than knee height, and now they're almost up to hip height. And let me, well, okay, so that pretty much, I think, answers your question. Is it, do you have any more that anything else I can say to clarify to help?
Yeah, I think so. Like most of the places that you were looking at, and I'm sure you said this, and I was just digesting the information slowly. But most of the places you were looking at, the process was mastication. That was the fuel thinning that was happening there.
Right. Did I get that?
I think so. So yeah, Alice, I think we're following you. So essentially, yeah, our sites have we've had all of the different treatments. We've had selective thinning on some sites, we've had mastication, and we've had prescription fire. We're still trying to get a bead on, the avian response to the particular treatment. But our sites are different enough. We're starting to tease that apart, and we have seen that oak is, incredibly rich for food for birds. And so we do see a big suite of birds move in when that oak is recovering. Or you think about chipping sparrows building their nests in that hip height, oak, that's instantly becomes way more advantageous to a chipping sparrow than when there's none. So, we're still wading through, trying to kind of differentiate these different treatments and how these birds are responding to them. But yeah, do you feel like we answered your questions? If not, we're missing.
Would it be, I mean, do you have like any sort of impression based on sort of initially, based on like what you're looking at? It seems like from the initial results of the observations, like the bird populations are reasonably resilient because there is a certain amount of regrowth, to put things very simply.
Yeah, but it does. We just like with the Turkey Springs site, which saw fire the first year, like we literally had just flagged our point trees and they started a fire. We were like kind of like our arms up, but they didn't know exactly that we were doing that right there already. Now they do. So there's better communication, but immediately we saw lower numbers in any of those ground brush foraging species, and any of the species that were nesting close to the ground, certainly. So we have seen like deleterious effects right off the bat, absolutely. Both with mastication and prescription fire. But we have seen, like you said, resilience and some ability to recover as those pieces are allowed to breathe and return to the landscape.
Yeah, in the end, there isn't anything that we've revealed in our data set that would say that the Forest Service shouldn't be doing these treatments, particularly in our environment. There are two reasons why, in a way, we're supportive of the Forest Service in being careful in the application of these treatments. Our community is in the middle of a forest. We are the WUI, the wildland urban interface. And we have had fires locally, which were kind of scary because they threatened the quality of water that the watershed supporting our community would have provided. That fire was suppressed very, very quickly, primarily because it was where it started was surrounded by areas that have been subject to, I think, prescribed fire and thinning. Mm-hmm. I don't think mastication was that influential in that case. So in other words, the Forest Service was able to suppress that fire pretty quickly before it really got out of hand. But the place that it did burn, it had a serious impact. That particular forest, we have to get back to it this year and find out what's going on there, but the overstory layer was completely eliminated. And so the question is the Ponderosa pine going to come back, or is it going to become a grove of Gambel's oak? And we don't know that just yet.
Hey,
So-
Herb, I'm gonna jump in here really quickly.
Sure.
I know it is coming on the hour, so if folks need to hop off, welcome to, but also we have time to keep on discussing for a few minutes, so let's keep this conversation going if people want, so. Yeah, just
Sure.
wanted to jump in. Thanks.
Herb, if you also want to talk about just, the mosaic piece, or,
Yeah.
I think that's important to mention.
Yeah, and I kind of alluded to that when we were talking about the common nighthawk, because there are other species that are responding in the same way, the ruby-crowned kinglet, for example. So what we're doing with the wildland fuel reduction treatments is creating heterogeneity in the landscape. So we have some locations that have properties that are favored by species like the common nighthawk or the western wood pewee, and other portions of the landscape that are favored by things like the red-breasted nuthatch and the ruby-crowned kinglet, which are prominent at the Jackson Mountain North site, which is very different from Fawn Gulch or Turkey Springs. So in other words, what we're doing is we're creating habitat heterogeneity that promotes, if you look across the landscape, promotes species diversity in the bird community across the landscape. A question I've asked of the Forest Service, and actually I know this, there's no clear answer to this, is when do these treatments promote heterogeneity versus habitat fragmentation? And that's a continuum that no one has an answer that I know of to when it becomes habitat fragmentation or habitat destruction versus promoting habitat heterogeneity at the landscape level. We know that a wildfire, that's pretty extreme, that's destroying habitat in a certain area. But we don't really have a good handle on, well, how big an area should we attempt to subject to prescribed fire or mastication, or even what shape of an area. Typically, their decisions are based on what kind of a threat that area represents to our developed community or our watershed. So they do have a strategy they follow, but it's not driven by landscape ecology or, at the present time, concern for the bird community.
I would just like to jump in on that point and say that I think there's a lot of efforts, especially in these Southwest fire adapted forests, to like really think about that and like how we're managing the forest and how it can be done better. So I think that's why studies like these are so important, to just kind of get more of that data. I think there's a lot of great research being done on just that.
Well, and again, the real value of this project as well is getting our citizens out there in the forest. And I mean, just improving everybody's appreciation for our surroundings. So I think that's equal importance to everything else we're doing.
Yeah, Alice, thank you very much for that question.
You're
Yeah.
good by us. If you want to, we can carry on.
Let's keep on chatting. I love chatting about birds and forest management. I had a few things that came up hearing you guys talk about this. And one was, given that some of these monitoring sites do have planned treatments in the near future, do you intend to keep on monitoring post kind of this next round of treatment? And is there kind of intention to have this be a longevity program?
Well, it's a very timely question because we're going to go out next week and pick some sites. There are some sites that we think we want to keep going back to continuously, the Jackson Mountain Reference Site, for example. But we want to clarify this observation we have about the recoverability of the bird community following treatment. So we may be looking at a couple of other sites next week, one of which has been thinned. So in other words, the overstory has been harvested, but meeting certain thinning criteria. And we may want to go in there and start collecting data in a site like that, as well as our reference site, and then possibly go back to the Turkey Springs site. which was burned in 2019, and they might be coming through there and doing another burn this year. We don't know yet. We're going to continue this year, we think, with the Jackson Mountain North site, collect one more year of data as a baseline data set for the adaptive silviculture project. Now, when they come in there, and many of you, if you've been involved in forestry at all, you know that when the machinery comes in and harvests the overstory trees, it can be pretty frightening how disturbed the shrub layer is, and I mean it looks like there's a lot of damage out there. Our observation is, well, we think it recovers pretty quickly, but we want to collect some data to confirm that. Are we going to go back into the Jackson Mountain North site after they do the thinning treatments for the ASCC program? We don't know yet. We're just going to have to kind of figure that out as the project continues. Each year, we survey our membership. It's like, well, who wants to stay involved? Should we keep this project going? And overwhelmingly, we get volunteers. We've got more than 20 volunteers already for this year's sampling. And as I mentioned earlier, there's at least a dozen of us that are involved every year. I don't know what's going to cause us to fizzle out, so to speak. I think we're going to keep going, and we're just going to keep refining the places where we collect data and the way we collect data so that we can feel more assured that the observations that we offer are valid.
Colin, I would say that we are planning, I mean, our hope would certainly be to get back in there to that ask site after. It's actually interesting because that particular site, we actually tried with Dana's help back when Dana was still with MSI at that point. We were looking at, I think, in those adaptive silviculture or climate change treatments, there are some classified as transition forests, some that are classified as resistance treatments, and some as resilience. And so we tried to span across all three of those, knowing that there's actually going to be micro treatments in those different areas, and so that we can actually hopefully glean some information about, you know, how each particular treatment may impact birds specifically. So there may be a nugget of information there potentially. Again, it's just we're kind of working at the speed that we can with the capacity we have, not knowing exactly when the Forest Service is going to conduct that. But at least, like Herb said, we'll have 3 years of pre-treatment data.
Yeah, that's great. No, I'm impressed that I know it's difficult to build something like this from the ground up. So really remarkable, successful. So you mentioned with like some of the high severity fires in the Pagosa area recently, that were like canopy, like the whole canopy's burning, and then kind of comparing that to some of these fuels reduction treatments or these prescription burns or thinning projects that you were monitoring. Do you have are you going to be able to kind of monitor bird effects of like some of these high severity wildfires in comparison, or be able to pull that data set from somewhere and try to look at that comparison? I just think that might be interesting.
That would be intriguing. I mean, the Plumtaw fire that Herb referred to earlier, which was about 8 miles north of town, it's not far.
Yeah,
as a crow flies.
Yeah, and it's not an easy walk from. Like I said, I'm in the youth group on this project. Not quite, but almost. And so accessibility is one of the issues, and number of volunteers. I would love it if we could get into the Plumtaw fire site. I mean, I've been up there, but it's maybe 3/4 of a mile of a hike up an old logging road.
Right.
To gain access.
Plus a 25-minute, 30-minute drive probably to get out there.
Right, exactly, and it's in a fairly remote area in that respect. So we have limitations. We're volunteers, and but there are many of us who would say, you know, bring it on. We'd love to be there. But that one just hasn't been practical at this point. But what a wonderful opportunity that would provide to collect some very meaningful data. So we'll see.
Yeah. That's
Come on
great.
up.
I would love to. With this will be my last question. I know that we're going long here. With the data that you have collected, have you been able to have some conversations with land managers about, say, snag retention, or even like private landowners being like, hey, here's a couple things that you can do that would really help these species that are in decline?
Yeah, that's the value of the San Juan Headwaters Forest Health Partnership, because it includes private ranch owners, as well as landowner alliances, as well as the Forest Service, Colorado State Forest Service, and so forth. And we're all coming together. They all know what we're doing. And in fact, we're in the early stages of planning a field trip to take members of that partnership out into the field with us in about the third week of June, and do a sampling while we're out there. And as I kind of alluded to, I think, somewhere in the talk, we've gotten feedback from one of the Forest Service personnel that he was actually surveying some of the areas that are going to be subject to prescribed fire in the next few weeks with the ranger, the district ranger, and they discussed modifications to their strategies that would protect more of the standing dead snags. I've even had one of the contractors come to me and offer a story in a positive way, that he was asked by someone why they weren't cutting down some of the dead snags, and he had to kind of tutor that citizen as to why these standing dead snags were important. This is from somebody who would much rather knock them over than drive around them.
Mhm.
So, you know, it's kind of a subtle impact that we've had, but I feel pretty good about it. I think they're paying attention. So
That's
And I
great.
do think, I'll just chime in too, Colin. I think that, just, I think the volunteer reactions to the project, and, maybe some of that, the way that some of those stories have circulated in town, I'd like to believe, are starting to feel a little bit more prescient to, some of these land managers. I think that we've had a slow, like you said, a subtle kind of impression on them. In the beginning, I do think there was a lot of like, wow, here comes the bird chapter. They think they know, how the forest should be managed, and we certainly didn't come in with that, attitude, but we did try to say, hey, look, maybe you're missing something here, and have you accounted for this? And they really hadn't. And so I think there were some open minds, but there were also some probably contrarians in the group to start with. But I think that we've slowly warmed them up, and having them come out in the field, if we can get some of those folks out in June, looking at some of these, for example, when we walk into that Jackson Mountain North site, I wouldn't necessarily, it's got a little bit more of a north orientation. So it's almost got a little bit moist mixed conifer right there. It's got more white fir in it, certainly Doug fir too, aspen and ponderosa pine with some oak clumps here and there. But certainly up here, white fir, it doesn't really get, I think a lot of people just don't see the value in it, but we have seen a lot of different dynamics to the bird community in those areas where there is white fir. And so we have really, I personally have just felt like, there's something to be learned there. Can we, there's some dynamic there. Can we retain pieces of that in areas when at all possible? Because certainly there are birds who are finding nesting and feeding opportunities in those zones that aren't documented elsewhere. So I would like to believe that they're looking at that raw data we're providing that shows that, and learning something from it.
And I think there's one other point that's pertinent. So recently there was a land management plan proposed by the Forest Service, actually for the Jackson Mountain area. And so they solicited public comment. And there was parts of that were pretty controversial. And they were kind of aiming at taking a pretty superficial approach with environmental assessments instead of an impact statement. And we were able to make a public comment with specific data about the bird community that would have driven them to conducting environmental impact statements, at least for one portion of that land management plan. And we think we had a big impact because they basically pulled that whole plan and they're redoing it. And because we were able to be specific and with data, make comments about the implications of what they were thinking about doing, we think it had a significant impact on their decision making. So there's no downside to this. You can't say, well, I wish we hadn't done that. I wish we didn't know that species was out there. There's no downside here. Everything is on an upside, and it's worth. And all of our volunteers that have spoken out have basically been very positive about the experience. So I can't think of anything that we've done that you could say, well, this was a bad idea. There's nothing. So having said that, I may go out and have a heart attack trying to find the next site. Maybe somebody will figure that's a bad thing, but let's hope not.
Yeah. No, I think it's great that you're out there collecting this data. And I think more and more folks are really putting a focus on kind of the impacts of these treatments. And it's, it's always messy. You're always weighing different things and everyone has different interests in all these things. But I think learning more about how these birds are responding is huge. I agree. There's no bad part about it and so many positives out of this project. Well, I would like to thank both of you so much for your time.